I'm Kelly. I am your sales technical consultant. So what that basically means is that if you need to buy something, I'm here to help you. But because I'm also a scientific technical consultant, I have a master's degree in molecular biology and I have a science background. I worked in the lab for about almost as many years as I've been doing this. I can work with people on how to do things. And so I give these seminars as kind of a side job of my job. But I am by no means an engineer, a service engineer. You don't ever want me to fix one of these things or try and tell you what's wrong with it, so always call those guys. So just a quick minute on our heritage, just so that you guys know, this is one of the reasons why Joe and Sharon and everybody decided on Beckman is we have a really long history. We have been making centrifuges longer than any other manufacturer out there. And our legacy starts from Dr. Arnold Beckman. He actually was a scientist and an inventor, and he was the first to come up with the pH meter. He had a friend that had a lemon grove and wanted to figure out if there was a way to measure the acidity to know when the lemons were ripe for picking. So he made it for him.
I was just at the Beckman conference.
Oh, yeah?
We heard a whole hour of the history of Arnold, our old Beckman.
Oh, okay.
Life, his family, his institute.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it goes on and on and on. This will just be a minute. He also invented the spec and other things that are not related to this world, like oxygen analyzers for babies. They were finding a lot of, way back then in the 40s, babies were having blindness and other problems, and it was because of the imbalance of oxygen. So he made this for the little babies. He's had other things like shark boomsticks for divers, and just, we used to have a whole museum that was just all the things he's done.
It's still there in Irvine.
It's not. It's we used to have a facility in Fullerton, and it had the complete full museum. I mean, it was like as big as this building practically, and you would walk through and all the way around, and they got rid of that building and they consolidated our second building, which is in Brea, where they kind of mixed the two buildings together, and so they had to shrink the size of the museum to like a hallway now. And so now there's pieces at different institutes and different things, but the whole museum is kind of gone. It's very sad, but he was a really, really neat guy, and he was actively involved with the company until he died at 104, which was about 15 years ago, or give or take. So these are some of the first ultras that were out there. Beckman Instruments, that was his company, acquired Spinco, which had a part in commercializing the first ultracentrifuge back in the 40s. And it was the first commercial centrifuge to be able to reach those kinds of speeds. Today, though, what we're going to talk about is a little bit of review of what Jeff showed you guys on how to actually use the centrifuge. But we're not going to talk about what button to push and how to program things, how, a little bit of review, but mostly it's just going to be a little deeper detail on how to maintain everything so that you're ensuring that it's not going to break as easily. You're going to have the longest lifespan of your instruments and your rotors, and that you're going to avoid things that are going to require repairs, things that are going to potentially damage things and hurt people, and just maximize your use of these guys. There's a lot of misconceptions in centrifugation. It's been around a very long time, so it's not some new innovative technology that people think, wow, this is really complicated and this is really cool. They just think, well, it's a centrifuge. Everyone knows how to use that. But with that comes complacency, and people forget that it's actually a very expensive instrument, and it is very fast. It is very powerful. So because of that, safety needs to be a very big concern. So we talk about G-force all the time with centrifugation and RCF. So that's because this is related to how your centrifuge spins down the rotor. Separation is affected by speed and RPM and by the maximum radius. So I just like that little, it's a Star Wars year, right?
Yeah.
So if you think about what G-force is doing on a stationary body, you have this weight increase based on that force. So 1 gram is actually going to equal 802,000 kilograms. that's quite a big difference than what you just think of, well, this little tube doesn't weigh much. How much force can this thing have? But when it's spinning at very high speeds, that thing is like a rocket. So now your students need to think, okay, well, this little tube, that's 50 mil tube, is actually a Honda Civic spinning around in here, and if it gets out of the centrifuge, I don't want to be in front of it. There is this little video that if I can get to work, I think would be great. Let me see if I can. Oh, okay. Let me go how to get out here real quick and show you guys this. Where's the?
If you go over the black box, it had a play.
Oh, it did?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, great, even better. I wasn't sure if it was going to come on. Oh, there it is. Okay. Now hopefully we'll be able to hear it. This is a video, an actual video of NASA training their pilots to withstand G-force and understand what that feels like before they shoot them off into space. So it's a great example of how we need to think about what's going on inside of our centrifuges.
It says this on the
Yeah. And let me go back then to, let's see, how do you minimize this thing?
left-hand side.
All the way over here. See if I can play it from here. Not looking like we're having luck.
Of course.
Oh, rats. I was really hoping I'd be able to show that to you guys. Well, anyway, if I can find a way to get it to you guys so you can view it and show it to your students. It's a really cool video that shows these pilots going through 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, and their faces are rippling and they're passing out and they're feeling sick and they're falling off of their chair and it's pretty dramatic when you think about if that's what they're going through at 5G and they're barely able to handle it, then these things that are going around in our centrifuges are going at 20,000 RPM and 20,000 times G. So it's significant, right? So it's good for them to understand and really visualize it. So when we think about what can go wrong, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. Tubes not being balanced is one of the most common. Tubes break during use. I think we are all aware that plastic is not infallible and these things do happen. A lot of times students will put in a wrong speed that is beyond what the rotor is rated for. Now we do have some safeguards that are built into the centrifuge so that it knows what rotor it is and what it's allowed to run. That being said, some older models may not have that advantage. So it's good to keep that in mind that if you have an older model, you might also have an older rotor in an older centrifuge that is no longer rated for what it was originally rated for because now it's gotten old and it's withstood some life usage. So it's if it was originally able to go 20,000 RPM, the engineer might tell you to derate it to use at only 6,000 RPM to be safer. So that might not be built in and it won't know that and you're the only one who's going to know that. So if you were to put in, sure.
When would we know that? That the rotor is derated? Do we have to send it out for service and it comes back with another?
Nope, you just ask the service engineers to come in and they'll take a look at it and they'll look at its age, they'll look at what it's, just how it looks as far as its integrity, if it has any cracks or pitting and things like that. They'll let you know if, most of the time they're going to tell you we recommend you retire it. But if you're going to still use it because it's up to you guys, then we recommend you don't spin it at top speed, and then they'll advise you on a speed that might be safer.
So that service engineer could modify the software in the centrifuge as well to change?
No.
He or she cannot do that.
No,
And
not on the older models.
Okay. And he or she would come on an annual basis, or they have to call them and ask them to?
So when you have a service contract or a warranty, they'll come out automatically.
Mhm.
But if you don't have that, then you'd have to call and ask them to come out and do that. One thing we can do, and I'll talk a little bit more about it at the end, is we can do rotor inspections for the department or the university, and we can just spend a day looking at all of the rotors that you guys have and making sure that there's nothing that they see that is a concern. So that could be done then.
And that would be with a cost or would it be with a service?
No, that would be, when it's done as kind of a university event through me, it's free. If you just call service, almost every time you pick up that phone and call them, they're going to charge you something. So it's unless you have a warranty or a contract. So that's one way that you can have problems. Something a lot of times people don't think about is there is a maximum sample density. So we've had, you guys will probably never encounter this, but we have folks that are spinning down like rocks, pebbles and all kinds of things, algae with all kinds of other crud in it and very heavy things. So there is a point at which if the density is too great, it may cause imbalances or it won't be able to run up to speed. Rotor lids not being put on or tightened too much or not tightened all the way, those are very common things that happen. Some rotors have canisters, and a lot of those canisters have expiration dates imprinted on them. And a lot of those canisters are carbon fiber, and everybody says, but carbon fiber lasts forever. Well, that's what they originally told you when that things started coming out with that material, and they didn't know any better because we didn't have 20, 30, 40 years of use with it like we do centrifuges with aluminum. And we're now finding that actually it does break down quite a bit. So they do break, and I actually have a picture to show you guys. So corrosion, it just happens over time, but it also happens from not being stored properly, from not being cleaned properly. All these things can contribute to things going wrong. This is a very dramatic example of a metal bridge. This is in Minnesota, I believe. It spans the Mississippi River.
35W.
Right next to the University of Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
My friend crossed it 20 minutes before it went down.
Are you kidding?
Yep, 20 minutes.
Wow.
You and Ellis were at my house that day.
What a blessing. Because we actually can't show this slide or this picture in Minnesota because a lot of people have family that lost their lives. There was quite a few people that died and many that were injured. This went down, was just out of the blue from what I understand. Didn't show any sign of needing repairs. It just failed in the middle of rush hour traffic. So metal is a great, wonderful material and it's very strong, but it does have its weaknesses. So this is something that you could potentially have happen and see this. So your rotor broke apart. It's very obvious. Okay, well this chunk broke off. You see this, but what you didn't see beforehand is the stuff that's going on inside those cavities. That's a little harder to see. They're dark and when people are not cleaning those on a regular basis and you just have gunk down in there eating it away, that anodizing eventually strips away. It starts to pit the actual metal, and that all causes weaknesses. That can lead to that picture before. This is another up-close magnified example of how you can see corrosion eating into the actual metal. And this is a cavity that's removed showing some corrosion and pitting. These are the things that our field engineers will come out and look for when they're inspecting your rotors to see, okay, are these things looking good and strong and solid and their surface is intact, or are we seeing a lot of this, which would indicate that its lifespan is going to be shorter than if it didn't have this happen, and what can we do moving forward to prevent more of this? This is what happens if you just ignore all of it. You don't get inspections, you don't listen when the engineers tell you, you need to clean these, and the entire centrifuge can be demolished. It's hard to believe, but that is actually what can happen from a rotor that fails during a run inside the centrifuge. Now, these days, we actually have a guy whose job it is to try and blow up centrifuges, big padded building. And because of the specifications for our certifications, there's lines that we put around the centrifuge at a certain number of inches, and it cannot move. If a rotor failure or some kind of failure happens, the centrifuge can't move outside of that little box, or we can't get it certified. So nowadays, with the steel banding and everything that goes on, if a rotor failure happens, it's going to really, really mess up your inside of your centrifuge. But it's going to stay there and it's not going to hurt anybody, God willing. In the past, before we knew these sorts of things could happen, people have all heard stories of rotors coming through walls into other stories and outside, and it actually, in fact, does happen. There's a lot of places out there that have things that are 40, 50 years old. So this is kind of my little slideshow of horror. And it's just to really make people understand that these things happen more often than you think. A lot of folks that I've talked to over the years, when we're talking about replacing rotors and rotor inspections, they say, oh, you know, that's an old wives' tale. That hasn't happened in 25 years. Well, this was, this one here was, I'll show you, it was about 6 years ago.
Oh.
And as you can see, a JA20, our nomenclature is the 20 reflects the speed it can go to, 20,000 RPM. This was only being spun at 6,000 RPM. But because it was 22 years old, that's quite old for a rotor. We recommend retirement 15, 16 years, depending on its use and its condition. That's what's now left of that rotor and that centrifuge. Things like this, when this happens, service engineers can come and fix it. They can put in a new chamber, but it's almost as much as it costs to get a new centrifuge. So it's a, you know, on a newer one, yeah, you'd fix it, but on something that's older, you don't even bother because it's just too expensive. It takes them a lot of work to do that.
How often would you recommend a rotor inspection?
Well, I would say every 3 to 5 years, depending on use. If you're using all of your rotors a lot of variables, a lot of different people using them, maybe a little more often. But you know, if you've had them inspected once and you haven't had anything new and you haven't used them at a very high volume, then maybe 5 years is good enough.
I wouldn't say we're high volume.
Okay.
We are not.
Now, that being said, we have folks that have had us come out and inspect everything, and there's nothing new, but then they have us come out and inspect them again. They don't heal, folks. They don't miraculously regenerate or anything. So they can get worse, but usually not better.
And then you said that the new centrifuge are not, if something was terribly wrong, the new centrifuge are built so that no one would get hurt. Is that true with our older model that we have up there?
I'd have to check the date on the manufacturer of that one and see what
Is it 1980?
The plus?
The plus is 1980 something?
I thought it was 96.
96?
96.
I don't know.
Unless you think it's older than
No,
that.
it's older than that.
yeah. We have to check.
I
I mean, the folks know, you know, kind of where the cutoff is of where things started to be more reinforced, and so they would be able to advise on that. Here is another rotor mishap, a 28-year-old rotor, a swinging bucket rotor, and that's what's left of the inside, and that was just a few years ago. This is a very large company, not a university, in the southeast. And these folks have hundreds of ultracentrifuges and hundreds of rotors. And they use them day and night. And ever since things like this started to happen, they now replace their rotors like every 3 years.
This is a virus rotor, so they were
Yeah,
spinning these really high speed too.
Yeah,
probably a single.
that was going fast. An ultra, that's at least 60, probably 60,000 RPM.
If you run that ultra, I'm running away that way.
This was at a blood bank. Now, I'm sure you realize blood banks, they're dealing with human blood a lot of the time, so very high biosafety precautions need to be taken. And so when things like this happen, it's a much bigger deal, like whether they can even touch anything to clean it up and who they have to call. And so this is where, you know, if I worked there, I think I'd just leave. I could find another job. You don't even go back if I did that. So that's a very unhappy,
Oh my.
that's a shot of the rest of the centrifuge with the lid of the big rotor in there.
We should have this stuff for Halloween.
Yeah.
I used to work at the blood bank,
Really?
but nothing like that ever happened.
Good thing.
The haunted
It doesn't
centrifuge.
happen. I mean, these things are not happening on a daily basis, but I would say every couple of years, our
I had one
engineers
happen
see
to me.
something. You did?
A bottle blew. And it was a 6 or, I can't remember how many, 500 ml bottles and one blew. The seal blew and it wasn't a biosafety and the whole rotor came off.
Yeah, once
Yeah,
those
yes,
rotors
spindle
come off of the spindle, it's a very bad.
Spindle cracks are yours.
Now you have to also think about the design of these centrifuges is that the rotor is inserted and tightened in the direction that it spins. So as the centrifuge is spinning, it can only get tighter, right? It can't loosen itself as it's spinning. So if something bad enough happens that centrifuge comes off the rotor or breaks the spindle, that's an enormous amount of force to cause that to happen. So it's no small whoopsie. Something pretty significant had
My
to have
student wanted
happened.
to be there to try to save the sample and I had to yell at him to get out.
Over at Scripps, just a handful of years ago, I had to stop a woman from leaping onto a centrifuge. It was not a Beckman brand, it was a different brand. And it was a large unit, and it was walking across the floor. And she started to chase it. Like, you're about 100 pounds, and that's about 1,000 pounds. You're not gonna win. Let's just stop. So it gets pretty ugly,
You take
4 years ago, those South people, you know. Another vertical rotor, gone bad. This is a canister failure. So this is an example of these canisters come out of the rotor and they do expire. So when the bottom broke off of that canister, it pushed the bottom of the whole rotor out, which it stayed in on the spindle, as you can see, but all the debris running around really did a number.
That one, are the canisters carbon fiber?
They are. And then this is just another example of what I was saying. Carbon fiber does break and it does degrade as opposed to things that they were telling people. You know, that Fiber Light company that's all about carbon fiber, they're indestructible, we have lifetime warranties on them, it's no such thing. All that black that you see is the actual carbon fiber of the rotor degrading and wearing off onto the sides of the centrifuge as it spins. So you could actually wipe that out. And so now this particular company had a secondary concern, not just about how long that rotor was going to last or what's going to happen, but what they're spinning cannot have black fiber dust in it, right? So some secondary concerns about contamination there. So all of these things here contribute to rotor stress. And most of the time, if you're just using it and maintaining it properly, these things are going to last a very long time with no issues. Making sure that you're using the right kinds of chemicals for the kind of tubes you have, that you're not spinning rocks, that you're using the right tools and adapters and everything that's been approved for your centrifuges as opposed to third market types of things that might not work as well. Making sure they're being balanced and lubricated, stored properly, all of these things are going to help you have a long life of these items. But that's what happens if not. When we talk about approved systems, and I put this up here because our engineers are trained as such to, we all often have companies ask those guys, can I use this thermo rotor in this and things like that. And our insurance and liability and all of everything that our policy states is that we have to say no. That doesn't mean it doesn't work. It means that it would be on you to test it because Beckman has not tested it. And we cannot recommend a bottle, a cap, an adapter, a tube, nothing, unless it has been tested by our facility and proven that it is safe to use. So, because we don't want to say, oh, that should be fine, and then you go use it and you blow it up. We don't want that to happen. Other companies are not as stringent on those kinds of things, so you just have to be a little bit wary if someone else were to recommend using things that haven't been tested by the brand of the centrifuge you're using. So we really just recommend that you keep everything together It's all Beckman. We have rotors that we do say, you know, you can use these conical tubes from any brand and things like that. So when we tell you it's recommended, then we've tested it and it's okay. If not, we recommend that you don't. A lot of rotor mishaps occur, as I mentioned, improper lid and rotor attachment. So we do have guides on the rotors that show you where the pins are, and that helps with proper installation. So if a student is unsure, I would say that would be your number one advice to them is if they are not 100% sure that they have installed the rotor and the lid correctly, don't turn it on. Ask for help. Just have a buddy, have somebody that they go to say, can you double check me? Just to make sure this thing is inserted correctly. And over time, they'll get more used to the feel of it, and then that probably won't need to keep happening, but it's just better safe than sorry. You really want to make sure that they understand the markings that are on the rotors, what those pins are, and that they're putting on the lid correctly. Balancing rotors is important. You want to make sure that it's symmetrical across the axis of rotation, particularly, so you don't need to fully load a rotor with all the cavities. You could load 2 and 2 on the other side, things like that, and leave the other holes empty. That is true for almost all rotors, with the exception of swinging bucket rotors. All of the buckets should always be put on, whether there's a tube in it or not. So a lot of times people say, well, I'm only going to use these 2 here and 2 on the other side, so I'll just leave the others off. Make sure they've used all of the buckets, the swinging buckets, whether they put a tube in it or not. And then for vertical and near vertical rotors where you have the torque caps, those all have to be put on as well. Dry tubes is important, and more than a damage to occur is more of a problem for you guys, where a lot of times you put in a wet bottle, especially those big 1-liter bottles, they're wet and they go in these rotors and then they become like a vacuum where they suck that thing in there and they're never letting it go. So then you need to call a service engineer to come out and work it out for you. And they can also advise you on things that you can do to get it loosened up, but it's a process and it's definitely no fun. So make sure that you're loading dry rotors, dry tubes. Overfilling is a problem because it spills and causes biohazards and corrosion. Underfilling is actually more dangerous because tubes are designed to be filled or filled to a specific point. So a lot of them are, you have to fill them at least halfway. So they all of the different labware has specifications to how full or how empty they can be spun. And so you need to make sure you pay attention to that because they can collapse and that can cause imbalances on its own.
Because we have so many different people using open and closed tubes, it would be really helpful to have like an image of the main types of tubes we have. And then say these types of tubes must be filled minimum this level, no more than this level. Is there a way you can help Sharon prepare something like that?
Do you guys have a poster?
Or
We
posters?
don't, only because we have hundreds of tubes
Right.
and hundreds of types. And so it would be a really big chart.
Or
to
maybe,
do that,
maybe
but
you could work with Sharon.
You
or-
can, like, there are
and-
certain things, like polypropylene, for example, is usually one of those that has to be filled at least halfway. If it's a thick wall, usually it's not as significant of an issue. So there's some, kind of just general rules like that, but it's really better to kind of have a list of the tubes that you use and then to remember exactly what those rules are for those specific tubes.
The institutional knowledge is limited because we're always dealing with new students all the time.
Yeah.
So I still think maybe if Sharon could identify the 7, 8, 9 different main tubes we use, and you can help say
Yeah.
this kind, right?
Mhm.
And then put together some sort of a visual aid.
Yeah, absolutely. We could do that. That's
That
not a
would be super helpful because we see it all the time, under and overfill, all the time.
Yeah.
Thin wall, thick
I would
wall, you
say-
name it.
Probably realistically, you could fit like maybe 15 or 20 on a page. So if you can send something like that, we could make a little chart that says
That
what
would
to
be
do.
super helpful.
We can work on that.
And then conical versus the round bottom. Sometimes someone will grab the wrong, like a conical tube and try to force it into the round bottom tube rotor, or vice versa.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of those different kinds.
Okay, thank you.
It's important to take a look for yourselves, especially if you're not gonna have regular rotor inspections by the engineer, to look at things like this. What these pictures are looking at are the pins. So you can usually just see by looking at them, whether, if, the number one thing is if they don't look the same size, there's some wear and tear going on one side. So if they both are looking kind of uneven and stumpy, then it might be time to look at getting those pins repaired and replaced. We can generally repair rotors till they're about 10 years old, and then rotor facilities say no because of just liability. You know, when they fix something, they want to be able to say, it's fixed, it's good for you to use, it's safe. But if it's 15, 20 years old, there could be 100 other problems with it, and then so they won't do that. Rotor attachment is important. You want to make sure that you know whether or not your rotor has a single tightening knob or a double. We often call the double lock lids a BIOSAFE lid. And it's basically just remembering how to put it on the spindle and how to tighten it down. So it's always righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, so that's easy to remember. And this is specifically for the Avantis. With this single knob, you would put the rotor in the centrifuge and then tighten the lid on clockwise. This locks the rotor onto the spindle and also secures the lid onto the rotor. If you have a dual lock lid, then you would want to first turn the lower knob clockwise so that your lid is attached, and then you put it in the centrifuge and lock it with the second knob onto the spindle. This is so that the reason why it's designed this way is so that if you had, you know, Ebola going on in there, no one is going to want to open that inside the lab. They're going to want to take that rotor out while it's still sealed and take it to a biohazard hood, things like that. So that's just enabling you to move that centrifuge from place to place without worrying about the lid being off and something that might have escaped that plastic tube being let loose. Not Ebola, obviously, because that's just, nobody would do that. Maybe SARS. Now with ultracentrifuge rotors, these are what our swinging bucket rotors look like. And if you can take a close look, you can see that that one bucket with the arrow is just slightly tilted. That tells you that it is not hooked correctly, and you're going to want to rehook it before you spin it, because since it's not completely on those little hooks, it's more likely to come off during the spin. And then that little metal rocket ship is going to go flying around your centrifuge. One way to avoid things like that is not picking it up like the top and making sure you handle it like it is on the bottom. Doing this is going to disturb your buckets less, and it's also going to keep your samples where you want. A lot of times people are running gradients and things like that, so your samples are going to be less disturbed as well. Lubrication is important. You know, I would love it if our engineers could come out to everybody's lab 2 or 3 times a year and just make sure everything's all greased up, but unfortunately we just don't have that many millions of people to do that. So we depend on you guys to have kind of a system where, you know, maybe a couple times a year you go through and you just check and make sure they're not dry. You're going to want to put spin coat on the metal threads of your rotor, and you're going to want to put vacuum grease on your O-rings and things like that that are on the lids. So all of that creates the seal that keeps everything balanced and spinning properly. Without those, they'll still work, but it's going to put tolls on slowly over time that you really would rather not happen. Improper tools are a problem too, and people don't think about it, but just using a wrong tool can scratch up your centrifuge and then leave it more susceptible to things like corrosion. All that anodizing is in place to protect it. So if it's scratched off, that that leads to problems. And with your ultracentrifuge rotors, since those go so fast, the balancing is even more precise that needs to happen. And something that people tend to do is they take those buckets and they just throw them in drawers instead of putting them on a bucket stand like they're supposed to. When they're in drawers and they're rolling around, they're metal bumping on metal, they're actually chipping away little pieces of it that not only lead to corrosion, but all those little chinks that come out of it actually lead to imbalances. They start weighing different amounts, and all of those buckets are weighted against each other so that they match, because we want to make sure that when we sell it to you, it's balanced. And then you know that when you balance your samples, it's going to be balanced. But once you start mixing and matching buckets and things start getting clobbered, then it's much harder to balance them. This is what we recommend for the best possible life of your rotor. And I realize some of this is unrealistic and a lot of folks are not going to do it, but it's really best to avoid condensation collecting in the bottom of your cavity by storing them upside down, especially after they've been washed or they've been, if something very corrosive was used in there, a solvent of some type. And you're going to want to store them in a dry place. Now, what that means is a million people in the world store their rotors in a deli fridge or a cold room so that they're already nice and cold when they go into the rotor or into the centrifuge, so they don't have to wait as long for it to come down to temperature. But that actually does lead to problems further down the road. So it's recommended that when you don't have to do that, don't, especially if it's going, you're not going to use it for a while, it's going to be months. Put it someplace dry instead of in that cold room. Just put it in the cold room the night before, if you can. Always want to remove your adapters before storage. That's another thing that tends to get stuck like no one's business. Very hard to get out when they're just left in there for long periods of time. Media and different things gets behind it and starts to glue it on there. And then, as I mentioned, don't put your buckets in a drawer. Make sure that those are all put on storage racks. Cleaning. It's very important. We recommend weekly depending on your use. Obviously, you're not going to clean something weekly that you only use once a month. But use your discretion and just inspect them periodically to see if they look like they need some cleaning. Make sure that you remove your O-rings. And now, one thing, this is where I would say if you need, especially during that warranty year, if you need the engineers to come out and advise you and help you with that, it can be an art form to get those O-rings back on where they belong. So if you need them to come out and help you, show you tips and tricks on how to make that process go quicker and easier, please call them. They're happy to come in and do that for you. Use mild detergent only, not Alkanox, not Comet, and things that are very abrasive, because that's all going to scratch up your surface and make it more vulnerable. And you would want to also make sure that any brushes that you use are soft and that they don't have metal exposed. So a lot of bottle brushes that you can buy in a hardware store would look like they would be great, but they actually don't have the metal tip covered with plastic. So you can get in there and actually start scratching up inside of your cavities, which is the most vulnerable place on the rotor anyways, inside those cavities. So make sure you get a completely plastic covered metal brush with soft bristles to clean it. And we actually have a cleaning kit for this purpose because so many people are like, I don't know what to get. So we have it available. It's like a lifetime supply. It's 2 bottles that are about this big with a concentrated detergent. So you would just dilute it and use it. It would last you a really, really long time, and it comes with 2 brushes. So if anybody's interested, I can get that part number to you guys, and you could pick that up. It's not very expensive. And then just air drying them upside down, lubricating everything, and making sure it's all good to go. That's a picture of the cleaning kit. It's all covered in the white plastic. Sterilization is possible, so we do have some sterilization recommendations. You can put them in autoclave, you can use 70% ethanol, just don't use bleach. And then if you guys have any biosafety concerns as far as, creepy critters that you're spinning, we'll just blow right through this then. We do just have several different layers of protection if that's something that you're concerned about or might become concerned about in the future. You have liners to go inside the bottles, you have different types of closures for your tubes. your rotors with those double lock lids. And canister systems are actually another biosafety method because you can take the whole canister and tube out. And we have a hard vacuum in the ultras. And we also have HEPA filtration systems available for the floor models. So those are all available should you need them if you're worried about what you're spinning down. There are several other built-in safety features: imbalance tolerant drives, imbalance detection. So if it does detect an imbalance, it will give you an error message and tell you so, rather than continuing to spin. So for the most part, if there is a mild imbalance, it's going to shut down the spin so that it doesn't have a potential for causing those kinds of pictures that we looked at before. Those pictures are more about like it's already spinning at top speed, there's no imbalance, and then all of a sudden that rotor falls apart. And so it's very hard to detect that ahead of time. And then having a very simple, tried and true single screw rotor that works with physics. You turn it in the direction it spins to tighten it is what we consider to be the safest and easiest. There's a lot of folks out there now coming up with all kinds of different ways. This is a top-loading ultra rotor, so people are liking that because you don't have to look underneath to see if it was attached. And very clearly marking where the pins will go. These are canisters for the tabletop centrifuges to protect your samples from to protect you from your crazy samples. And this is a little bit about that inspection program. You can have the field engineers come out, and you could call service and ask them to come out and inspect a handful of rotors, and they might charge you an hour of labor or something like that. Or you can set something up through me where I block a couple of hours of their time and we come out and take a look at everything and we give you a report. So, and then that would be free. These are just a quick look at the rotors that have the warranties that the rotors come with. Ultras come with 5 years. High Performance, which is the Avanti that you guys just got, has a 7-year warranty. And generally bench tops are 1 to 7 years depending on the model. They all are recommended for retirement somewhere between 10 and 15 years, give or take. And a little bit more sometimes for the ultra rotors if they're not used a lot because those are titanium, more often than not. But again, if you really want to make sure that you're getting anything fixed, if it's possible, get it done before it's 10 years old. Because they can fix a lot of things, and it's a lot cheaper than buying a new rotor. But once it's over 10 years, it's really hard to get anybody to fix them. So hopefully today, we can make sure that you guys and all your students will avoid a day like that, where they'd never come back to school again, once that happens. So, any questions you guys have? I know it's kind of a lot, but yet not even a handful of what really happens when you use these things, so does that help?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. That's all I have for you guys. Thank you.
So I do have a question since we have a bunch of users here. If we get that second centrifuge, you know which one we're talking about, the tabletop?
Yes, we were looking at the Allegra X14, I believe, right?
And that will have in it the swinging bucket rotor. Can you talk to this group a little bit about that swinging bucket rotor and about balancing issues because it's a self-balancer?
Well, it's kind of misnamed, okay? It's not a self-balancing. It's a self-correcting, smart balancing rotor. So what that means is up to 50 grams. If you load your samples in and they're within 50 grams of imbalance, it will tolerate that spin and continue to spin it because it has a yoke at the center of the rotor where it's got a very viscous oil and ball bearings. And so wherever it detects an imbalance, those shift to that area to correct that imbalance. So it'll just keep spinning. So what people are enabled to do with a rotor such as this is you can eyeball your samples and make sure that they're roughly, balanced and throw them in as long as you're still putting them in correctly. You're still not going to want to just haphazardly insert them anywhere. You're going to want to make sure they're bounced across the axis. And that's just enables you to do things quicker. Otherwise, what you're recommended to do is balance all of your samples, and that takes a lot of time. And so most people don't want to do that. They'd rather just be able to eyeball them, throw them in, and start your run. If a standard rotor does not have that feature, what happens when an imbalance is detected is it's just going to stop the run and bring it back down. And then you're going to come back in and you're going to say, oh, well, that didn't work. Now I have to start over. So at least with the self-balancing, it can keep things running to completion.
Is there a rule of thumb for how closely tubes, let's say 50 mil tubes, 500, 250, 500 liter tubes, how closely they need to be matched to each other?
Well,
I know there's lots and lots of different variations.
it
but
is.
Can you give us some guidelines, so we're not gonna hold you to a rule of?
It's very difficult because in a ultracentrifuge rotor,
But just with the centrifuge we have, we don't really have an ultracentrifuge.
well, that's what I'm saying. I'm just kind of, as an example, we can give that kind of number with an ultra rotor because it's literally like within 0.2 grams. You want to be on an ultra because it's so finicky and it's going so fast. And then it just varies greatly from there with floor model centrifuges and tabletop centrifuges. So every single rotor is going to have its own imbalance tolerance, and that's stated in the rotor manual. So it might be helpful to just, some people will just mark it down somewhere, like this rotor, this gram intolerance, things like that to make it easier to remember. I could look those up for you guys based on the ones that you have, and
Is that something you would like to have? Help us, Sharon?
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we can do that. Because like I said, we have about 40 Avanti rotors, and they're all a little bit different. I would say generally within 0.5 is a good rule of thumb, but some might be a little less and some might be a little tighter, so it's good to know what they are, have an understanding of that. Those rotor manuals are really powerful. People almost never read them, but they're actually really useful to know how to deal with your tubes and what the different types of tubes can do and things like that. Any other questions?
Storing centrifuges, on and closed or open and off, which is, if we don't, if they're gonna be unused the next day or half a day or over the weekend, what's the best way to leave them?
If you're gonna leave them over the weekend, I would say on and open is good.
On and
Or sorry,
open?
off and open, because
Okay.
then it airs everything out, make sure it's all dry. If you're going to just overnight till the next morning, then just leaving them on and closed is good. And that, especially if you're gonna, want to keep them cold. So for ones that are not refrigerated, it's not as big of an issue, you could just turn them off.
So a good policy might be for our Avante, oh no, what is our new one?
The big one is the Avanti.
It is Avante. All right, to leave that on and closed during the day, during the week, and then on Friday, when we have a student come through, have them shut it off and leave it open so it airs out and dries out.
Do you want that?
That would be, what do you guys
A
think?
good SOP is to turn it off and then take the rotor out, store it upside down, and take a towel or like paper towels, wipe out any, because sometimes there's a large amount of condensation or just things that drip in there. Clean it all out, just nothing fancy, just wipe it. And then let it dry the rest of the weekend
And do that
that
every
way.
Friday.
Yeah.
But otherwise, closed and on through the week.
Now I can ask him to do that. He usually does it too between 2 and 5 or 2 and 4.
Yeah, and then if somebody's in the middle of it,
Someone
then
is- then it doesn't.
that weekend it might not happen, or we figure it out.
Right, yeah, missing a week is certainly not gonna, kill anybody.
Does that work for, what do you think? Yeah.
And anytime you guys come up with like questions on how to use the centrifuge or how to maintain anything like that, that 1-800-369-0333 service line, they have a whole technical support team that's just there to answer phones and answer questions like that. So, I'm usually doing stuff like this, so you call me and you have to wait, 2 days to get me to call back because I'm always from one to the other. But those guys are right there in tech support, ready to answer questions.
Can you say that number again, please?
Yes, it's 1-800-369-0333. And what they'll ask for when you call, just so that you're prepared, is they'll ask for some kind of a serial number or a system ID of one of your centrifuges so that they can identify who you are and what you're calling about, things like that. makes it easier for them to direct it where to go, make it faster.